right, if everyone could please take a seat. Jeremy, can this go louder? Can it go louder? Can you make it louder? It's a bit quiet, isn't it? Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to GlobalHOME's second education event for the year, Healthcare When Disaster Strikes. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney has been built. So, for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Teresa Youb, and I'm one of the education officers for GlobalHOME 2014, along with Julie Fan. And we'll be your MCs for this evening. So tonight we all have the incredible privilege of hearing from three amazing speakers, Dr. Kavita Varshney, Colonel Len Brennan and Dr. Chatu Yapa, all of whom I'm sure will offer invaluable insights into their experiences with healthcare when disaster strikes. So at the end of each of their talks we will have some time for questions, so please leave them till then. And for now I'd just like to invite Julie up here to introduce our very first speaker.
Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm Julie, and I'm the other half of the education officers for GlobalHOME 2014. So it's with great pleasure that I'd like to invite Dr. Kavita Varshney to the stage. I'll give you a brief introduction. Dr. Varshney is a UCID alumni graduating from the MBBS program in 1997. She is an emergency physician whose subspecialty is in disaster medicine. She's worked in Nepal and India, and she's recently come back from a deployment to the Solomon Islands addressing a recent flood crisis. So, Dr. Varshney, hand it over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Yep, perfect. Fantastic. So thank you very much to Teresa and to Julie for inviting me to speak with you tonight. As we've said, we'll take questions at the end, so yeah, please feel free to ask them. I am an emergency physician and disaster medicine is my subspecialty. I've done a master's in disaster medicine and also an international diploma in humanitarian assistance. The first thing that you'll realise when you become interested or involved in this area is there are many, many players, and I've just tried to sort of summarise them there in governmental agencies, United Nations sort of agencies, non-governmental agencies and military, and you'll be actually hearing from three of those groups today. So I'm speaking to you from a government perspective and in fact from an AUSMAT, which is an Australian Medical Assistance Team perspective. So this is a definition of what AUSMAT is, but just to put that into some context, so it's multidisciplinary, it's doctors, nurses, pharmacists, radiographers, logisticians, so they're usually firemen, but it could be other groups, and sometimes also paramedics. Public health and psychiatric support is also included in part of that. And the teams are actually designed to be self-sufficient once they're deployed and to be rapidly deployed. Most of this actually came about after the 2004 tsunami, when Australia realised that we had a very state-based approach to what was going on, and there was almost a competition between states as to who was going to respond and who wanted to get there first, and that sort of thing. So we actually tried to standardise what was going on. We standardised training. We set up an equipment cache, which is held in Darwin as one of the closest capital cities to most of the region that will be affected, that we would be likely to respond to. And then in terms of how do you get picked, so the first thing is you must complete AUSMAT team member training, and it's not just based upon your medical skills. You obviously have to have the right sort of personality type to go into potentially austere settings, to work with team members that you don't normally work with, to work in an out-of-hospital environment if that's not what you normally do. They also do a lot of training about security, personal safety, radio communication, all those sorts of things that are important parts of being part of a team. There's also team leader training, which is obviously a step up from that basic level, and that involves a lot of communication and interaction with the other agencies and other teams that are around. We do our sort of basic disaster training is something called Major Incident Medical Management, and again, it's just a way to standardise and talk the same language that the other people are speaking. You need to be vaccinated, and there's a big list that they give you of things that you must be vaccinated for, and it's up to you to maintain that vaccine regime. Obviously, when you go, you need to be healthy. There's no point going if you have obstructive sleep apnea and require a nocturnal CPAP machine, if you may be deployed to an area where there's no electricity. Just those sorts of things. That's not to say that if you had a chronic medical illness that was controllable, say asthma, diabetes, epilepsy, something like that, that you couldn't deploy, but obviously it has to be within a reasonable, controllable sort of environment. What's different about the way that I work to maybe some of the other speakers is that I have a normal day job, which is with a different agency, if you like, a different employer. And we have a pre-existing understanding that if something happens, and it's obviously usually at very short notice, that I can be released and that I can therefore go to assist. And then there's the element of chance. So obviously there has to be a given event. You have to be available at that time. It has to be your state's turn, because what we've done now is set up a rotating roster, so each state takes a month at a time, so it's your state's turn to go. And then it has to be your turn. So within the state, obviously, there are many people who have completed those prerequisites for selection, and it's essentially just, who's next on the list to get asked. You do have the opportunity to say no if you're not available, if you have some other issues or commitments. So it's not that you must go if they ask you, it's just that you're asked first, and if you say no, they move on to the next person. And then you stay there waiting. Obviously maintaining your vaccinations, you've got everything ready to go should you be called at the last moment. You have a sort of mini pre-packed bag always around, and wait essentially for the call, or for the event. So what happened this year for me was in Honiara in April, there was heavy rains, flash flooding, 50,000 people displaced, and 10,000 were living in evacuation centres. So that sounds very organised and controlled, but evacuation centres was actually just normal schools. So there were 50 people in a classroom, minimal sanitary sort of set up, basic toilets and things. So you can imagine 50 people in a room. You just need one or two to get a respiratory illness or a diarrheal illness, and you have a big problem on your hands. So what happens next is that the government of the host country that the event has happened in must ask for assistance from the Australian government. Put that up there. So, so the Solomon Islands government requested assistance both from Australia and from New Zealand. Australia went to the New South Wales government because April was New South Wales' turn. New South Wales government went to New South Wales Health, who went to Westmead Hospital, who asked me. So that's how that process worked. So you can see there's quite a lot of steps involved in that. So I received a phone call, I think it was a Monday at about 10 or 11 o'clock, and it was to go for the next day. So I obviously had to speak to my boss and sort out my roster and make sure that the shifts were covered, sort out any other things that I was doing, such as teaching commitments, any lectures I was giving, anything like that, just all had to be covered, and hand that over. Sort out things at home, make sure there was someone to collect mail, someone to pay bills, all those sorts of things, just to make sure that that's all done while I'm away. I don't have children, but if you had children, you'd want to sort that out, make sure there was somebody looking after them. Same thing with pets. And essentially what you want to have is that your life is under some sort of control so that you can focus on what you're doing while you're away. What I actually did that night before I left was have a look where I was going and what was going on there. What was it normally like in the Solomon Islands? So it was obviously part of Oceania, tropical climate, population was approximately 600,000, multi-ethnic group, very religious community, and quite young. So that was important for me to know before I went there. And I went a little bit further and found out a little bit about what's the existing state of medical care in the place that you're going to. What's the infrastructure? What are the cultural beliefs? What is the expectation? So I'll explain a little bit about our team in a moment, but essentially where we were going, they decided that the best place for us to be was within the hospital and within the existing infrastructure. So they placed our team within the emergency department at the hospital. But this was a hospital that had no emergency physicians, so we were a new concept, if you like. They did have 3 ED trainees that were training via a system in Papua New Guinea, so they did know that that's what they were trying to achieve, was to get to emergency physicians. In terms of these infant and maternal mortalities, they're kind of mid-range. So Solomon Islands was middle of the range in terms of the entire world. Fairly reasonable life expectancy. Interesting there, when you looked up the HIV rate, it said not applicable. When I was there, I found out that what that actually meant was it's not tested. So we don't know, is the answer. And it was dengue and malaria season in addition to everything else that was going on. So this is really important just to get a sense of what's going on before you go. You pack all your things. So as I said, the cache of equipment is in Darwin. So we were heading to the Solomon Islands, and the way to get there is via Brisbane. So that's logistically a little tricky. So the other Australian doctor that was in the team was from Darwin, so she had to bring my kit as well. That has some very basic things, so utensils, cutlery, sleeping bags, torches, mosquito nets, insect repellent, all that sort of thing that you would expect. You also get uniforms, which we'll see in a couple of slides from now. And you add to that your own personal things, so your underwear, your toiletries, all that sort of thing, and that's your kit, basically, and you're good to go. And it's maintained really well by the staff at the Northern Territory Centre. And then essentially that's how we got there. We flew commercial airlines. Sometimes you may fly with a military airline, like a military provider. It just depends on where you're going and how they're going to get you there. So this team was interesting because, in fact, New Zealand was actually leading the team. They had been training, and AUSMAT had been deployed many times to Pakistan in the floods, to the Philippines with the Tacloban earthquake and typhoon. But this time New Zealand had trained enough people that they felt able to lead the team, but they did request from Australia 2 emergency physicians, so that was us embedded within a New Zealand team, essentially. So we all flew to Brisbane and met each other that morning, basically, and arrived in the Solomons. We get there and we're essentially met by both the ambassadors from Australia and New Zealand, and we're briefed about the situation of what's currently happening, what's the healthcare situation, and very importantly, what's the security situation, what were any risks to us, and what was our expected response to that. So the biggest risk was actually a tsunami alert or another flooding or earthquake. And we had been told that there was a sort of a tree, we would be called and we had to get to higher ground, and we were given a map and shown this is where you go if this call comes to you. And of course it did, it did happen one day, 1 o'clock in the morning. So basically grabbed our clothes and went up to where they had told us to go to. It is very important that we do that though. Then we got to the hospital that afternoon. So this is the NZATMAT team in the beige tops and the AUSMAT team in the blue tops with the beige pants. And this was us deciding how we were going to... So we basically worked out where we were going to be, which was within the hospital, how we were going to split ourselves up, how we were going to work. We created a roster. We realised that the local hospital had no blood bank and no source of blood. So as a group, we went around and wrote down our blood types should anything happen to any of our team, just to be prepared rather than waiting, till the last minute and finding out we didn't know this. So if a patient required blood, their family member had to donate. That's how it worked. We also discussed security. So again, as a team, we said that we would never go anywhere alone. If you were going to go somewhere, you would go in with a buddy, and the buddy would come from your little group. So our group was made up of 4 emergency physicians, 4 nurses of an ED ICU background, a public health officer and a team leader who was from the Ministry of Health of New Zealand. And he was essentially organising all the logistics of where we were staying, how we got from A to B, organising our food. And we had 2 logisticians as well. And then it was to work. So that all happened within a day. So I got a phone call Monday. This is Wednesday. We're now working already. We're on the ground working. You'll be surprised at how much of the chronic disease you see, because that is still going on within this community. And I was surprised at how much asthma there actually was in this population. So despite having so much asthma, there's only one nebulising machine, and they share it, the same mask. They just kind of dip it in some water and the next person uses it. So we devised some spacers, which are essentially water bottles that we cut a hole in, and you pop the Ventolin or the sort of puffer in there, and the patient breathes from the top end. So it's a homemade spacer. So our loggies worked out that that's what we wanted when we explained it to them, and they happily cut them up and did that. You can see the Ventolin sort of sticking out there. That's a little puffer sticking out of the bottle. And you will see a surprising amount of chronic disease amongst the acute stuff that you expect to see. Lots of trauma, which was fairly standard, but again, it was important to keep things simple and to keep things the way that they were usually done at this place. You don't want to go somewhere and impose first world expectations and first world standards in a developing country. So it was very important that we be guided by the local clinicians as to what they would normally do with this sort of thing. They actually had quite good surgical support. They had orthopaedic service, they had general surgery, they had vascular was sort of with general, but there was no spinal surgery, and we did actually have a patient with spinal injuries who, you know, here would probably have had a lot more done, but there it was much more, okay, we'll just treat anything we can and then just sort of palliate essentially. So that can be somewhat confronting because you know that possibly there's more you could do, but you have to remember you've got simple things. There was no CT, there was no MRI, it was basic X-ray and a very, very, very old ultrasound machine. But we could still do quite a lot with that. Having said that, there were some things that were much more advanced than what we have here. Within the ED, there was a malaria lab. It was literally sort of across the hallway from where I was seeing that young boy. And you could get the results back within an hour. I mean, I can't get that at Westmead, which is a tertiary referral centre, you know, probably one of the biggest in Sydney. And yeah, you could actually go in there and have a look down the microscope and have a look at what they're looking at. They've got pre-packed anti-malaria for treatment and ready to go. So you basically give it to the patient as a pack. Here you go. Whilst I'm sure I'd still be running around trying to find the scripts, find the tablets, work out how to tell them what to do. But it's all set, ready to go. Same thing with dengue. You could get rapid testing and results back very quickly. Just want to show you some of these pictures. So these are, this is the resuscitation bay down here. So again, very simple, very old beds. Nurses do their best to sort of clean it up and keep it as it is. This is one of the local nursing staff and one of the NZMAT nursing staff. This is the ECG machine, so very, very old-fashioned, clip-on and suction cup, which most of you would probably never have seen, and that's why it's really useful sometimes to have a nurse who's quite experienced and who has seen it before. They don't get sort of put off by not having the machines that they recognise. They didn't have any ventilators, so therefore you couldn't intubate anyone. It was that simple. And that's just how it was. They didn't expect people to be intubated, so that made it in lots of ways a lot easier. If a patient died, and we did have a couple of patients that died while we were there, the family would take them home wrapped up in a blanket there and then, which for me was quite unusual because here there's such a process and the patient has to go to the morgue and then they have to be identified and so on. But that's just how it was. The family would wrap them up and take them home. This is a little kiddie who had an intraosseous needle, so we'd actually taken an intraosseous. We left it there. They didn't have them. So that was something that we did introduce as an outside sort of technology, if you like, but it was found to be quite useful and it was easy to teach how to use it, so we kept it there. But yeah, that was essentially the setup. And yeah, lots of paediatrics, so if you go there thinking, oh, I'm an adult doctor, like you just have to be very, very flexible. So I work at an adult tertiary centre, but my first day I had to put a drip in a 3-week-old, and you just have to, you know, do it, get on and do it. one thing we found quite complex and difficult was actually keeping track of our patients. There's no computer system, there's no board or, the way that we would normally do it. And then we actually found that they did have a board. It was just there was no nails to hang it up on the wall with, and there were no pens, marker pens to write on it with. So our loggies managed to, salvage it from where it was hiding in a cupboard and put it up for them. And, our great delight was that it was being used even when we were leaving. So that was great, because it was simple things. They just hadn't got those last little bits to get it to the end point. We managed to sneak in a little bit of education. So this was not a direct objective of our deployment. We were just tasked to go there and to assist and support the emergency department, which was being overwhelmed by all the patients. This was in the National Referral Hospital, so it was the biggest hospital in the country. But we realised within our team that we had a skill set that could do some education. The nurse that you can see there is an ALS trained nurse. I do a lot of work in simulation. So there was a lot of people with the experience to do it, and we did very low fidelity. So that was our patient. He had a volleyball for a head and he was wrapped up in a little suit. And we managed to do ALS algorithms, basic life support, learn how to do a log roll, very simple things, but it was really well received. The local staff were very keen and very, very willing to learn. So we managed, even though this wasn't our direct objective of the mission, we managed to incorporate that into what we were doing. I was asked to sort of talk to you about how you would get involved in this and how you would do this sort of work. I mean, it's really very dependent on what you enjoy doing. So I really love emergency medicine. I'm really glad that I have that as my other job, my day job. But there are many specialties that have involvements within disaster health: psychiatry, surgery, anaesthetics, orthopaedics. So I think it's important to still pick what you want to do, because you've got to really love that job. Once you've worked that out, you can sort of find out what the avenues are within that field to get into this sort of work. I think it's important to work in developing countries. I haven't talked about it in this talk, but I have done lots of work with the Australasian College of Emergency Medicine. We support quite a lot of countries who are progressing emergency medicine within Asia and the Pacific. So I've been to Nepal and to India, and we've basically, in Nepal, there are 4 trainees there at the moment. They're being taught and trained by Australian FACEMs, who provide them with 9 months of supervision through a year, which is fabulous. So it's not one person for that whole 9 months, but it's each of us taking a turn. So you can go for a month or 2 months and so on, and that's how they're getting their education and support. Lots of work happening in Burma and Vietnam, and I mean, you name it, and there's a lot of work going on. Lots of websites that you can read up and try to keep up to date. Try and get some volunteer work under your belt and just make some contacts, and that's often the way that you can get started. And I just took a little screenshot of this. So this is a website, that's the Relief website. And it just kind of has a running sort of commentary of different disasters around the world, what's happening, what's the latest information and so on. So you don't have to rely on sort of BBC News or NBC or whatever to get your information. And I was going to stop there. I'm sure there's lots of questions.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Varshney, for that incredible account of your experience with the Solomon Islands and for telling us a bit about AUSMAT. So we'd like to open the floor right now to some questions. So does anyone have any questions you'd like to ask? To kick us off? Yep, down the front.
You mentioned needing to discuss with your current boss, your day job. How did you go about doing that? Were they very receptive?
Yeah, so and I think that's the other beauty of emergency medicine. A lot of us have very different interests. So some of my colleagues are emergency physicians and toxicologists, others are emergency physicians and retrieval specialists. I'm an emergency physician who does this. So my colleagues know that that's what I do, and potentially it's obviously always at short notice that I might need to go. So they're always willing to cover a little bit here and there. My boss is understanding in that he knows also that that's something that I do, and we've discussed it beforehand. I mean, I've done all the training and that was always with the expectation that this was going to happen. Yeah.
Okay. Yep, I see a few more questions. I might just quickly run to you with the microphone to make things a bit easier. It's in the recording, so I might actually just...
How long were you there for, and do you know when you get the phone call how long you'll be away?
Yep, so most deployments with AUSMAT are 2 weeks. They find that that's usually, and you're working every day. There's not, 4 days on and a few days off. It's working 2 weeks. Occasionally it could be longer. So with the Pakistan deployments, they were for a month because it was actually just so hard to get people in and out that they kept them there for a month. But generally the standard deployment is 2 weeks. Having said that, it could be longer. So even when we were leaving, the day that the replacement team or the Bravo team was coming, there was storms and we were not even sure they were going to land. So you're told 2 weeks, but the centre at Darwin's actually very good. They kind of keep contact with your family and let them know what's going on and when you might be expected home and so on. So it's roughly that 2 week, 3 week mark, but it could be longer.
Okay. Yep, at the back.
I know you said you had a go bag for small things, but to what extent do you rely on them having resources there to administer the care that you want to?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So AUSMAT teams have decided that we have, amongst that bag are our ration packs. So we have food, we source water locally, but we go with food, bedding, clothing, everything that we would need to actually set ourselves up. This time we were quite lucky. We decided because the infrastructure of the hospital was intact, we would work within that. But if we wanted to or needed to, we could set up a tent hospital, and that availability is there. So that's when the logisticians really come into their own. They're fabulous and they just sort of help set everything up. Having said that, the whole team obviously has to help do it. So this deployment was in lots of ways, if you like, a bit easier because we had a hospital to work within and we had a hotel that was in reasonable condition that we stayed in. So that in that way it was a lot easier. So we didn't need the sleeping bags and so on. We could sleep in a bed.
Yep, question over there.
Hey, do you know if there are any work opportunities in disaster medicine for JMOs?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I don't think, so I think my answer is going to be I don't think so, and I think the reason for that is because there's not the ability to supervise. When you go here, you have to be fairly independent because there's no one else to sort of ask. If you split your team into little bits, each bit has to be able to work on their own. I think that in the States they possibly do have some sort of internships that they'd send you with someone else, but I don't know of any in Australia, not that I'm aware of. And I think with someone like MSF, and I think our other speaker will be able to tell us, I'm pretty sure you have to be at least an RMO 2 or 3 before you can go.
Does anyone else have any questions? No? Okay. If not, I might introduce the second speaker. So the second speaker is Colonel Len Brennan. He's the current Chief of Army Fellow and the previous Director of Army Health. Trained in general practice, he joined the Army in 1991, I believe, and has had various deployments including East Timor, Papua New Guinea, Germany, I think, and the Solomon Islands as well. Just earlier this year, he was awarded member of the Military Division of the Order of Australia for his exceptional service to the ADF, so please make him feel very welcome.
Okay, that sounds like it's working. Next presentation. Well, that's coming up. I can't claim to be an ex-Sydney University student. My daughter, however, plays water polo for Sydney University and hopes to come here next year when she finishes her Year 12 in Canberra. And I'm a Newcastle boy, but there's not too much rivalry. Okay, I've been asked to sort of cover a few areas. So one is to put a bit of context around how Defence does disaster management, humanitarian assistance. I'll give you 3 examples from my own personal experience in the Army, and then after each of those, I'll give you a few key take-home messages and give you a bit of an idea about your options as far as working with the military. First up, the military's mission is to defend Australia. So its core business is warfighting, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief is not its number one job. Having said that, our job is to support whatever the government's interests are, and we have a particular regional focus. So we do have an interest in being out in the general region. But whatever we do, it's whatever the government directs us to do, rather than us waking up in the morning and deciding we'll pack our bags and go and be helpful. And we have a third role, which is to provide support to, even within Australia, for disasters. And that generally, again, is that final level of support. Each of the states are responsible for their own disaster responses, and then when things get a bit over the top, they call in the military. Why do they call in the military? It's part of a whole of government response. The military has lots of assets. It has the mobility and the capability and capacity to move it around the place. And inside there we have a bunch of health capabilities, like hospitals, like preventative medicine, some specialist niche areas like forensic medicine. And to give you an idea, we've got big planes, we've got big ships, and we've got boats that can move things like bulldozers ashore into remote locations. And you can see in the top right-hand slide there, we've got hospitals that you can put in the middle of nowhere, and they're relatively self-sufficient. So they're the sorts of things that are reasonably attractive about a military option. Right? They never send us to London or Paris. It's always other places. So examples of responses, and I just quickly ran through. In Australia, we respond to bushfires, but big bushfires, the ones in Victoria, floods, cyclones. So there's set disasters that you can expect in Australia, usually around Christmas time when you're supposed to be having holidays. And so the military has a set response, and it's pretty straightforward to activate. We have a couple of niche capabilities in the chemical, biological, radiation area, and obviously we have a terrorism response that hopefully you don't get to see, but our special forces would provide that. Inside that there are some very specialised medical capabilities. In our area, in addition to the cyclones and the floods, you have tsunamis and cyclones, and we've had to respond to a number of those consistently throughout the region. And occasionally we get called in with that forensic capability. So we'll have people looking over in Ukraine at the moment, and we previously, if there's a plane crash or like a ferry sunk in Tonga, then they'll call in that specialist capability. And in Australia, we occasionally do humanitarian responses. The Australian Army has had a long relationship with Aboriginal communities in Northern Australia. We have 3 sort of battalions that spread across the whole of the top of the country, where we've got Aboriginals who work as patrolmen, and they live in their communities. They put on a uniform a couple of weekends a month, and it's a source of income, and it's a close relationship that they develop. On top of that, Army for the last 15 years has been going out to very remote communities. You can tell from those dots that, one, they're in remote places, and you probably haven't heard of most of them. And we'll take a team of 40, 50 people, and they'll spend 3 to 6 months out in those areas doing some engineering tasks, doing some health tasks. They love the vets to go out there and fix up all the dogs and so forth. Worm lots of children. And examples of responses in the region, obviously our core business is civil disturbances, so you would have heard that we've had troops in East Timor, Solomon Islands, Bougainville, for large chunks of the last 15 years, although all those missions have wound up at the moment. But we do other missions. We work with the Americans, and there's an exercise-specific partnership, which every year has big ships that sail throughout Southeast Asia and has medical people on board, as well as some engineers and other people. And as they come through, and they're doing humanitarian type assistance and capability development and enhancement type programs. So it's an opportunity to get to know the area before it gets into a crisis, rather than after it's got into a crisis. And out in the Pacific, there's still lots and lots of unexploded ordnance from the Second World War. So most years we'll have a team go out to a lovely Pacific island and blow up bombs for a couple of weeks and come back, and they'll go to another one the next year. So using examples from my own experience, it's going back a little while. You can tell from my grey hair that I have been around a little while. But in 1998, there was a major tsunami up in Papua New Guinea. You can see there the tsunami site on the north, and Vonimo's the sort of the biggest town that was close to that. On the Saturday night beforehand, Australia lost to South Africa in the footy. I remember that. I went to bed, got woken up a couple of hours later, and we had the message that there'd been a tsunami and we were to move. By Sunday lunchtime, we're on planes flying off to Papua New Guinea. So that's the rapid type response. And the team that we took up there was predominantly a surgical team with a bit of X-ray pathology, environmental health and some aeromedical evacuation. Small team, 29 people. That gives you a view of the what a tsunami does. So normally there isn't all that water in the middle there. So that's from there. And when the planes first flew over there, they didn't see much damage because the whole villages that were along there had just been completely wiped off. And what you saw in the lagoon were these floating houses and debris. That is pre-op in our field hospital that we deployed. That is operating theatre 1, and right behind the anaesthetist, who would be managing on 2 patients, was operating theatre 2. And that's post-op. So very rudimentary. So what I highlight there is, less than 24 hours to be out of country, hit the ground at 6 o'clock in the morning. First operation was performed in the local hospital at 8 o'clock, and that surgical facility there took its first patient at 12 o'clock that day. That extract out of the MJA. Now we saw 250 patients in just over 10 days. Most of those were seen in the first couple of days. That's 200 odd surgical procedures on 130 patients, and most days we're doing about 30 surgical procedures in a day. One qualified surgeon, one registrar, one anaesthetist, and a few general duties. And in that time we had 2 deaths. Both died from aspirational pneumonia from the tsunami, and no surgical deaths. And our follow-up at 2 months, we had 2 further deaths, both from complicated malaria after we departed. So a very busy tour, but you can tell from there we were there for 10 days and worked for 9 of them. At the end of it, you can see the staff there were tired, emotional, and one of the best sights was cleaning off all those stretchers and packing up and getting ready to go home. And there's a little extract there from the Sydney Morning Herald, which sort of was that symmetry about the support that we received during the Second World War and somehow being able to reciprocate that. So, considerations. Individual readiness, that's already been hinted on. Our people need to be ready to go at very short notice. To operate in this area, what do you need? You need hepatitis A, hepatitis B, MMR, pertussis, tetanus, typhoid, meningococcal, Japanese encephalitis, polio. Then you have to have anti-malarials, and you'd need to really deploy with your clothes dipped and bed nets. So it's not the sort of stuff you can wake up in the morning and decide I'll go out and help something. It takes prior preparation. We work as teams, so when we deployed, we knew everybody that was going there, and they had worked together, so you know the personalities. If you haven't been to sleep for 48 hours and you're starting work, you do need to know each other's nuances, otherwise things get nasty. You have to know your equipment. Our equipment is basic, but it's standardised. It's the same stuff every time you go. And the other thing is expertise. So our military expertise in that situation was a surgical capability, and that's what we deployed, that's what we focused on. There was still a local hospital there that could deal with the other aspects of the disaster and a lot of the medical management. So you stick with what you know you're good at, and then let the locals do what they're good at. And a deployment like that was incredibly demanding, but professionally one of the most rewarding things I've been involved with. Next example I give is in 1999. For those of you who are not familiar, Oecussi is an artefact of history. So here's this Enclave. It's in West Timor, and that's the East Timor. So in the September interfet, led by Australia, multinational force had come in and restored security. It took about a month to take care of that part of the country, and then it came time to move down there. So we sent a team, 9 whole people, storming the shores with the Special Forces and the Gurkhas to find a deserted town, essentially. And then with essentially 2 trailers worth of gear and a bunch of humanitarian stores. That's the team. That was our accommodation for the 3 weeks that we were down there. And this is what you found. So I went out around the province, and throughout the place you could see these villages. Those patches used to be huts, and they've all been burnt to the ground. And when you fly over, you think the place is empty, but you get out and land the helicopter, and by the time you walked into the village area, you've got hundreds of people turning up and singing your praises. Back in the main part of Oecussi township, churches, very religious background. The Catholic Church was spread all over the place, and were a place of sanctuary, and that's where the internally displaced people eventually came through, sitting there. But that was designed as a church, not for a place to look after 12,000 people. So very quickly give you an idea of what sort of stuff we do. So this is the camp. So over the space of 3 weeks, it went from nothing to just over 12,000 odd people. And our clinic, the 2 doctors, a couple of nurses and a few medics, we're seeing around about 50 odd new patients a day, plus your reviews. What you saw was what you expected to see in a tropical environment, so lots of malaria, lots of diarrhoea, skin conditions, respiratory tract infections and trauma. So you can predict all this before you go, so you've got a rough idea of the sort of things you're going to get to see. Age group wise, about 1/3 were kids. I don't normally on a day-to-day basis look after many kids. They act like kids sometimes, but most of them are over 18, but not when you're deployed. So from that, what do I take home? Third world medicine again, it's different. And if you take your first world approach to primary health care and try and do it, it doesn't work. It's very inefficient, and it won't be sustained once you leave. I found you can look up the World Health Organisation. We will tend to use the World Health kits, so we know what drugs are going to be in there. I like the MSF guidelines, despite that being in French. When you buy them, it's English, and you can get them online as a PDF version, and it gives you a standardised approach. When you're delegating a lot of primary health care to non-doctors, like medics and nurses, it's handy to have a standardised approach that allows you to do things safely. And one I found challenging with this was not our area of expertise. It was appropriate for the military to go in there first off, because it was an uncertain, insecure environment. Then it's a case of working with the NGOs to come in because they're the people that are experts. But each non-government organisation has its own agenda, just like I work for the government and we've got our agenda, and it can be quite challenging because the two don't always marry up. You think everyone's working together, but they're all subtle differences. And the last one I was going to mention was Siev, which was a suspected irregular entry vessel. Back in the days when there were only 36 of them, I think we're up to about 5,000 or 6,000 now. But I don't know how many remember this, but essentially this is Ashmore Reef, and there was one of these vessels coming in, and it caught on fire and exploded. What you had out there, 2 patrol boats, so big fishing boats, not much more, with 1 doctor, 1 medic, and the ship's staff on it, and they ended up with 30 odd critically burnt patients. When I say critically burnt, they all ended up in the burns unit, most of them intubated, ventilated, plus 18 minor burns and injuries, 5 people who drowned as part of the thing, which didn't require much treatment. But they're stuck in the middle of nowhere. This is in the middle of nowhere. So that's what I call remote medicine. And my job at that stage, I was on our Joint Operations Command, so we were coordinating how we're going to respond, because our military people had these people and didn't want them anymore. They wanted to get them somewhere else. But how do we do that? And essentially what you find is out in the middle of nowhere, there's an oil platform, and this is a bare base airfield, and you've got to get them to Darwin, over here somewhere, or down to Broome and then down to Perth, and you have to figure out how to do that. So essentially it was a 10-hour steam by patrol boats to the platform, onto the platform, a couple of hours down to the airfield by helicopter, and then from the airfield they went Broome, Darwin and Perth. So that's what a CAV looks like, overcrowded. That is the space that the doctor had in which to operate or look after 40 injured people. It got a bit better on the oil platform, but you can see still not great. And that's this airfield that at Truscott. So essentially our evacuation plan had the poor doctor looking after them 10 hours to get to the platform. We managed to get a civilian team out onto the platform with emergency physicians. That's the first time patients were intubated, ventilated. The worst ones then went from there to the airfield. We had a military and a civilian staging flight there, and then with military and civilian AME aircraft moved them through the rest of the country. That process from there to getting into a civilian hospital was just over 24 hours from when it first blew up. So it's a long time to have a sick patient in your care, but it's pretty impressive from the remote location they were in. So what do I take from that one? Do the best with what you've got. No one hops on a patrol boat expecting to manage 30 critically burnt patients. Boats, our Navy boats by nature have a lot of training in burns because there is one of the risks of being on a Navy boat, and they do have reasonable stores there, but not for that number of critically injured patients. You can find yourself in remote locations. These doctors, up until then, had spent most of the time fishing off the back, doing a bit of swimming every now and then, and once a week or two they'd have a boat that they'd have to do some health checks on people. And in the space of no time, the job description had changed quite dramatically. And that's where mass casualty decisions come in. Now, clinically, if you're in an ED department, 10 of those patients would have been intubated immediately. But if the doctor had intubated one of those patients, then they would have been left 100% looking after the one patient, and there's still 39 others to worry about. So they're difficult decisions that you may have to come across. Okay, so if you're interested in disaster-type medicine, what are my take-home messages? We call it the 6 Ps. It's really about prior preparation, preventing poor performance. You need to be physically and mentally robust. This is not a place where you go to find yourself when you've been in a bit of a crisis. I do encourage you to get some disaster management training. There are short courses. One here, University of Queensland, James Cook up in Darwin. There are the MIMS courses that were mentioned, AUSMAT courses. The military run a number of courses. Mount Macedon in emergency management runs some courses there if you want to get into the management side of disasters. So get some training before you go out there. And I think the same goes. Get some humanitarian experience before you go into the disaster so that you're actually used to being into this austere environment. You know what's normal as far as healthcare goes and you're not too shocked when you get into a disaster situation. Pick up some basic language and cultural awareness. So, Pidgin, Tetum, Bahasa, they're not actually that complicated, some of those languages, to get a little bit of knowledge with, and that makes a big difference when you're interacting with the locals. Right attitude. Some people go out there trying to save the world. It's stereotypical, but American, big, boisterous type people coming in there, there's only one way, it's the right way, it's usually from Texas. People are very polite, so the locals will smile at you and humour you. but you're just making yourself feel good. You need to respect the local health staff. They're the people who are there after you go. We found amazing after tsunami and some of these other disasters that they're out there helping you, despite the fact that they've probably lost 3 or 4 people themselves. They've definitely lost lots of cousins, because everyone's got cousins, they're all related. They're really amazing, and they'll point you in the right direction as to what's important to them. And don't be a burden. So when you go across there, that's why the military works well, is that we tend to be self-contained. So we don't take up every flight that gets in there, because it's our aircraft that go in there. We come in with our own food, we come in with our own water, and if we get sick, we look after ourselves, so that you're not draining in the population. Our experience in Banda Aceh, in Sumatra tsunami, they had a military hospital in there relatively early. We only probably needed one hospital, surgical hospital there. It only had one hospital before the tsunami. But you know, the rest of the world came in, and there was another 5 hospitals there, all able to do lots of surgery. But that really wasn't desperately what was needed. You know, if people were listening, they wanted some basic sanitation, good water supply, some of those basic engineering infrastructure, not more and more hospitals who can do acute surgical procedures. Okay, options. So again, I'm in uniform, so I'll tell you about the military, but there are different ways to skin the cat. So there are 3 services. Obviously the best army, that's my background. We're the largest, we have a northern focus, and sports medicine and tropical medicine would be our little niches. The Navy, obviously they like ships, and for that reason they seem to be able to justify pretty good real estate, so they've always got stuff by the ocean, and they've got an interest in underwater medicine and submarine medicine. Air Force, planes, if you like planes, they're good fun. We sleep under real stars, they sleep under 5 stars is how we describe it. So generally life's pretty comfortable in the Air Force, and their interest is in aviation medicine and retrieval type medicine. As a specialist, it doesn't really make a big difference, except when you go for your officer selection board. So if you go into an Army one, tell them that you really love Army, and if you go into an Air Force one, tell them you love Air Force, because they don't really appreciate it when you say, well, I wanted to go to the other guys, but I'm just practicing with you. Types of jobs, full-time. So when I grow up, I'll leave, but I've been working on a primary healthcare background with a bit of sports medicine, a bit of trauma, and a chunk of tropical medicine. And we do have sort of niche specialities if you're going to stay for a longer period of time. We have got a new training program where we take some of the guys and put them through specialist surgery, anaesthetics training, but not straight up. You do your time 4 or 5 years as a general duties medical officer before you go into your specialist training. And then we've got a big chunk of part-time, and if that's probably the avenue that most people would find most attractive. You know, you get on with life. The specialties that we particularly look at is our niche, which is that surgical capability, but good general physicians, not easy to find, but good general physicians and general practitioners have a good role in the organisation. You'd think we'd like some paediatricians, but we don't have lots of them. We don't have any geriatricians. But there are a role for a number of smaller specialties as well. And I was asked to talk about work-life balance. You know, as a full-time member, you know, my major thing is to balance it with my family's expectation. When I went off to East Timor, when I went off to the tsunami in PNG, family just got back from posting in Germany, which is all very nice. But I'd been back in country 4 days, and then left my wife behind with a 1-year-old and disappeared up to PNG to sort out their problems. Don't know how long you're going for, but we had a rough idea, a couple of weeks rather than months. The next time when I went off to East Timor, I was pre-positioned to go up to Darwin for the Services Protected Evacuation, where they were evacuating people out of the High Commission. It was supposed to be a 10-day trip. Came back 6 months later, because we went straight from there into East Timor and then came back in February. So as a full-timer, that's part of what your family expect that you do go. But it works out. I've done about 6 months out of every 3 to 4 years. So there's a nice balance to recruit when you get home. On a part-timer, military leave, most organisations will give you 2 weeks a year military leave. Your service is always protected, so your employer cannot sack you when we take you away. And in practice, short of World War II, World War III, it's all voluntary, and we negotiate with you as to whether or not you'd like to go now, would you like to go later, and we'll try and plan it as far as we can in advance. Much harder with disaster responses, but there's a group of people that are really ready and keen to respond to those. But there you've got the added balance of your employer, and it's really about your work colleagues often. So as a specialist, most often the medical supers, he's all right. Everyone else will pick up the load. It's really your colleagues that, if you've got a good relationship, it means that when you come back, you don't have to do every weekend for the next 6 months. You've got a fair go. If you reach a critical mass, so in a couple of hospitals, we've got a number of doctors who are in the military, and one goes off, and the others will quite happily pick up the load, and their turn will come around. And then you've got to manage the expectations. As far as deployments, so most military activities are 2 weeks. Most disaster responses would be about a 2-week deployment. When we go on to peacekeeping type operations, they're about 4-week deployments, and then you go into a warlike environment, you're going away for 8 weeks. And that all really revolves around how difficult it is to change people over and the amount of training you have to give them beforehand. Okay, yeah, you can go into Google and find out how to join, or you can see Joe out the back if you want some more information. But the sponsored program is pretty generous. And I'll open up the floor to questions.
Okay, so thanks so much for your presentation this evening and keeping our expectations in check and detailing really amusing anecdotes with us and sharing with us what it's like to be in the military and pursue a medical career in broad strokes. So I'll open the floor up to questions tonight, so I'll have to run off.
I can do it without.
Oh, we're recording, so...
Hi, thanks for the talk. It seemed like there's some pretty intense, kind of emotionally draining, heavy periods. I was just wondering, is there like much kind of lightness that goes on in those times? What I'm really asking is if it's much like MASH.
You have a team, and the team has some fun. It's not quite MASH, but it is, and they're shared experiences. And most times, the deployment's just plain hard work most times. But when you come home and you get back into a unit environment and you have a barbecue, everyone has a great recollection. It's a shared experience. I said, most medical people, I guess the trauma of it's hasn't been too bad, because if you work in an emergency department, you do see some pretty horrible stuff on a regular basis. So I found that the staff who had come out of a public hospital type environment had no problems. Some of the young medics were the ones that struggled the most, who really hadn't had a lot of experience. Those who'd been on the ambulance service and seen some trauma were okay.
Thanks for your question.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting. I was just wondering, do you work much with translators or interpreters when you work in these new places, or local people who know about the culture? And do you ever find that the language and cultural barrier sort of interferes with how you're able to work?
Yeah, I guess disasters are often a little bit different. So when you're delivering humanitarian assistance and some of those longer missions, you really do need to have the right language skills. So, but for instance, when we went up to the PNG Tsunami, we took a number of Special Forces soldiers who'd had very good pidgin English. I'd spent 2 years in Port Moresby, knew the area well, spoke pidgin. So as long as you've got a sprinkling of people. When we were in Oecussi, we found 3 local English teachers who came through, paid them $1 a day, and they worked as interpreters for us. From a surgical perspective, often there isn't a lot of need for consultation. A lot of those wounds were clearly get in there, debride them, clean them up. But a number of the patients needed amputations, and we needed to sit there. often involved local padres who tended to have better English capabilities. As I said, my staff had we were based in Liverpool, so working at Liverpool Hospital, trying to convince them that going to Liverpool Hospital where there is a whole large population of people where English is a second language, soldiers just sometimes didn't get it, but in fact when they went on deployment, there was a whole population where English wasn't their first language either. So, having had some exposure to different cultures, different languages, holds people in good stead. And hence that comment about if you can do some humanitarian work in slow time, I think that makes you better in an emergency situation, more aware.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions?
I was wondering if you could give an example of where an NGO and the military were in conflict in their agendas and how that affected healthcare.
Yeah, so again, I won't have a dig at it, but when we're down in Oecussi, for instance, we'd been down there for 3 weeks, and the first NGO organisation, I think it was Oxfam, came in, and they hopped off the helicopter and went for a swim, then came up and we showed them around. And, there was no press down there, and they went home, and they didn't come back. And we went through a couple of other organisations who came down, had a look at it, and then went home before they came in. When we first went into Dili in early September, we would coordinate a NGO meeting where we're trying to ascertain, share responsibilities around, and we'd had people fighting over what they want to do and where they want to do it. From a military perspective, we'd simply line troops to task and say, okay, you go take this quarter of the city, you go take that quarter of the city, you take that quarter, and cover it all, whereas that wasn't meeting the objectives of the various NGO organisations. So once you get to understand and don't have assumptions, so Oxfam has a different capability to MSF, who has a different capability to someone else. So it just takes a little while getting used to it. And that was my first experience of working with 6 or 7 different NGOs in an environment that I hadn't been off to too many East Timors before that. So it takes some getting used to. And there are some NGOs that are very independent and therefore don't want to have anything to do with the military. So you just get used to that. So a lot of the times MSF are very cautious of not being seen to be associated with the military, even if it's not necessarily a conflict, as a disaster. But those pictures go around the world, and it's not necessarily in their corporate interest to have that misinterpreted, because a picture's a picture. When it's in another country, they may be seen as not being impartial, and that's important when they're in that environment.
Does anyone else have questions?
I just wanted to quickly ask, I was speaking outside to Jo about recruitment and volunteer deployments of specialists, and she said that essentially you guys have a list of medical professionals that you draw upon when the time comes. And I wanted to talk about what it takes to sort of get on that list. So you mentioned that obviously people who express their interest firstly, and then there are disaster medicine courses. But I was wondering, is there something like an interview where you sort of assess the person to see how suitable they would be for recruitment or anything like that?
Yeah, so essentially, before you go on one of our missions in uniform, you've joined the military. It's not like we take you along for a try before you buy type experience. And the environments that we go to, if nothing else, you want the death and injury benefits that we've got associated with being in uniform. So we go through a selection process and just see whether your personality matches the military organisation. So I come across people who really want to get in there and help and do humanitarian work, but really don't like working in regimental type environments where you might get told what to do, and that they're not really compatible, and they go off and do their first military course, and they don't like the style of teaching because it's a bit you will do this type approach. And once you get used to it, it's water off a duck's back. So different personalities can cope with it. So having come into the military, Then you get posted to a unit, and those units have different responsibilities. If you're posted to a unit that's a hospital, that's where the specialist list comes in, and the hospital will basically take you on exercises and make sure they're familiar with the equipment and the layout before you then get tapped on the shoulder to deploy. The deployments where I was in charge of, I knew exactly which specialists I wanted to take, and they knew me very well. I send my staff out with a little bag to get a couple extra top-up vaccines, and off they come. So it really is horses for courses. As the operation matures, things become more comfortable. So the first 3 weeks that we were in East Timor, it's living off ration packs, sleeping under a piece of plastic. But towards the end of the tour, we had people inside sheltered buildings and getting 3 square meals a day. So it takes different personalities at different stages.
Okay, thanks so much for your talk this evening. I'd like to introduce our third and final speaker this evening, Dr. Chatu Yapa. Dr. Yapa is an RMO who is currently undertaking a Master's in Epidemiology at the New South Wales Ministry of Health via ANU. She's had extensive involvement with MSF as a medical team leader, and this has taken her to South Sudan, Syrian refugee camps in Iraq, and the Philippines. But I'll hand the mic over.
Okay, sorry. Do it. or more than half of the contexts that we work in are unstable. So that's either directly in a conflict zone or in a post-conflict situation. So you can imagine, obviously, all the hotspots at the moment, Syria, Central African Republic, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, we're all there. And then some of the stable contexts are the kind of more longer-term chronic disease management stuff like HIV and TB, so places like Cambodia, Sierra Leone, although they have Ebola at the moment, so not so stable, etc. So those are the kind of different kinds of, I guess, disaster type scenarios that MSF is involved in. So armed conflict is a big one, followed by epidemic and endemic diseases, where there's healthcare exclusion, like before obviously this Ukraine crisis, MSF worked in the prisons in Ukraine to give TB medications to prisoners because they weren't receiving that, and then natural disasters as well as it happens. So a huge part of working on the field is a team that you work with, and contrary to popular belief, the medical team is a very small part of the bigger team that's involved in making a project happen and making things work. So certainly we have doctors and nurses and pharmacists and midwives and nutritionists and nurses, but also very importantly we have logisticians. So these are the kind of people who make everyday things happen, from finding food to eat, to finding accommodation, to making sure that the hospital is supplied with water and electricity and has a generator for oxygen machines, and then these guys, water and sanitation engineers, to provide water and latrines, toilets where they're needed. And then as well, there's human resources and admin staff. So these are the people who will help us hire local staff, who will pay their salaries, and kind of get things moving for the projects. And importantly, very importantly, is the local staff. So there's a combination of expat and national staff who work on any field project. And as of last year, there were about 30,000 national staff in all of our projects around the world. So it's quite a lot of people involved. So that's a little bit about MSF. This is a little bit about me. So I'm Sri Lankan originally, but I grew up in Samoa. I lived there from the ages of 5 to 12, and then I went to high school and did med school in New Zealand. I did my first year at Middlemore Hospital in Auckland, and then I worked for a year in Darwin and the remote kind of communities in Alice Springs as well. So that was fantastic experience to kind of, if you're thinking about heading overseas, working in the communities in some of the kind of remote areas is fantastic experience. It gives you a real taste of what to expect when you have no resources, when you're the only one in a hospital. It's kind of a good introduction. So working for MSF was a dream for me. It's something that I've always wanted to do. And in 2012, I got to go on my first mission to South Sudan as a medical doctor. And I worked in that little squared box called Abyei in a place called Agok. Now, I'm not sure if you know, but Sudan has been at war, or has had a civil war for 50 years, for more than 50 years. And South Sudan, the newest country, gained independence in 2011. And maybe as you're aware, the violence has restarted in December last year, and now there's about 1,000 to 2,000 refugees per day crossing into Ethiopia and Cameroon and Congo and Chad, and there's more than 100,000 killed just in this conflict alone. So it's South Sudan is an example of a chronic emergency. It goes through periods of stability and then it goes into instability. So that's what it looked like when I was there. It's quite barren, quite desolate. The villages are quite spread out and far apart. So you can imagine, giving healthcare in this kind of context is quite a challenge. That was our field hospital. So I worked at this field hospital that served a population of 30,000. These are the kind of little tukuls, as we call them. That's where we lived. So it's just basically a brick hut with a thatched roof over, and we had our own little bakery just there, and every morning someone would come in and bake us fresh bread. That was a bit of a treat. And this hospital had everything that MSF kind of offers for a field hospital. So it had inpatient pediatrics, adult medicine, a maternity and neonatology. It had an inpatient therapeutic feeding centre for malnourished kids. Had a TB ward, and it also had emergency surgery. Separately, there was an outpatient department as well. So I was the only expat doctor in this 90-bed hospital, and I was supervising a team of clinical officers who are kind of like physician assistants. And so that was quite challenging kind of through 2.5 years out of med school, you know, having done some kind of work in Africa before, and I guess in remote communities, but not having faced the kind of medicine that you see in this context. And so you learn to be very creative. You might have seen Ventolin inhalers like this being made up before, but you cut a Coke bottle in half, you put some tape around the edges so the jagged edges don't cut the skin, and you stick a Ventolin inhaler, and it works okay as a spacer. And then that's a little child who's severely malnourished, who I really didn't think would make it, but if you know, through this kind of supplementary feeding techniques, it did really well, and she did really well, and was discharged. So, you know, sometimes one of the kind of hardest things about working in this context is the lack of resources, and so all you had there is we didn't have a lab or any kind of diagnostic ability. We could do a finger prick hemoglobin. We had a microscope to look for malaria parasites. We could do urine dipsticks and pregnancy tests, but that's about it. Everything else is good old history and examination. So you have to really you know, trust your clinical judgment and develop those skills, I guess, and that's something for you guys to take away, I guess. But a lot of the time, you just have no idea what's happening. You know, you get these weird and wonderful skin rashes that, you know, the differential is probably huge. And you know, here's a child with TB meningitis, which I didn't even know you could get until I went over there. And it's, yeah. So some really interesting pathology, I guess. But someone asked about MASH, and we certainly it wasn't quite MASH style on the field for us, but we did have some fun. You know, you get to work with an incredible team and meet people from all over the world. Just in this photo here, there's we have an Argentinian surgeon, there's a German field coordinator, we have a water and sanitation engineer from Niger, an Italian nurse, there's me, a Swiss nurse, and an Australian logistician, and a Slovakian pharmacist, the blonde. So, you know, people from all over the world kind of coming together to make things happen. We actually, this is for South Sudan's first year independence, and we try to recreate the South Sudan flag. That's what we're trying to do. Probably not so well. And then my second mission was as a medical team leader in Domiz refugee camp in northern Iraq, and that little bubble there points to where Domiz is. So it's in the northern Kurdish part of Iraq, kind of bordering the northwest of Syria and the southwest of Turkey. So, as you know, Syria has been at war since March 2011, and it's probably the worst humanitarian crisis at the moment, probably the worst since Rwanda in 1994. And there's about 2.5 million refugees and 6.5 million internally displaced people, so it's massive, and probably not enough is being done about it. So in terms of what this means for health, I guess there's issues inside and outside the country, but as you know, access to healthcare, medical supplies, staff who have left the country are obvious problems for inside, and then for outside the country, you know, all those 2.5 million people have fled to just the surrounding regions of Syria. So the majority are in Lebanon. Some have come over to Iraq. There's a large number in Iraq as well, and Jordan has 1 or 2 refugee camps. So that's what Domiz refugee camp looked like. Some of it, a lot of them was just tent structures, but some of them were kind of solid, you know, concrete structures as well. So some of the obvious problems in a refugee camp are overcrowding, water and sanitation issues, not having kind of access to all the services. So it's really interesting in the Syrian conflict as opposed to South Sudan, because the Syrian the Syrian population expected a lot from us in terms of healthcare, and probably much more than MSF are usually used to providing. In South Sudan, as a country that has absolutely no health infrastructure, for a population of about 10 million, there was one ICU during independence. Sorry? Oh, do you want me to use this? Sure. And so, so when they came to this refugee camp, they expected healthcare services to be at quite a high level. They were expecting cardiac catheterization and surgery for their groin hernia that they'd had for 10 years. So it wasn't necessarily everything that we could provide, and that was certainly a challenge. So what we were doing in the camp was primary healthcare activities mostly. When the original camp was built, it was only built for 10,000 people, and by the end of October last year, there were 60,000 refugees, which just goes to show the constant turnover, or the constant rate of refugees. So every week we had about 2,500 consultations, and that was done by 6 general medical doctors and 12 nurses. We had a gynecologist and midwife, and we had psychologists as well. And what was really good about our setup was a network of community health workers who could spread information in the camp and spread messages about hygiene and health promotion. So that was a really good tool to have. And my job in this camp was to coordinate the medical activities with the local Ministry of Health and other actors, so other NGOs and the UN organizations. It was also to manage the expat medical team and to kind of troubleshoot with the national medical staff, and then to kind of do plans for emergency preparedness. And one of the things that I had to do was a cholera preparedness plan. Cholera is something that I'm not, how often is it taught in med school? It might be like the bottom line of your diarrhea lecture or something. Watch out for cholera in a refugee camp. But you actually, and you go to these settings, and part of the challenge is learning about all these diseases that you probably have heard of once or twice in your life till then. So this is an example of a cluster meeting, and where coordination is one of the biggest things that is done really badly in disasters. In South Sudan, for example, there were more than 200 NGOs when we were there, and probably even more now. In Iraq and Syria, there are tons of NGOs, and as Colonel Brennan said, knowing who does what where becomes a real big issue, and you can end up going around and round in circles trying to figure that out. And as I learned in the Philippines, which I'll talk about, and sometimes that doesn't really get you anywhere. And so part of MSF's kind of operational role is because we're independent, we just go and do stuff. And don't necessarily partake in meetings like this all the time, which is not so good as well. So meetings, and more meetings was kind of the theme of Iraq for me. But as always, lots of time for downtime as well. This is in one of our staff homes, I guess, in the refugee camp. We had a lovely lunch, and so some of the kind of semi-constructed places in the refugee camp were quite nice. That they tried to make it as homely as they could, and they're incredibly hospitable people. We went down to the river one afternoon and had a little swim. That was really nice. That doesn't happen very often. That was once in 6 months. It was a bit of a treat. So I'll talk quickly about the Philippines as well. So I was in the Philippines on my last mission for Typhoon Haiyan. So as you know, the Typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines on the 8th of November, and it was the strongest storm recorded at landfall. And it was the deadliest typhoon on record as well, killing more than 6,000 people. And we were in Tacloban City, which was one of the worst affected areas in the island of Leyte. And that's what it looked like coming in. The military were there trying to evacuate people who wanted to go out to Manila or Cebu or other places where their family was. Tons of people waiting at the airport to get out, and total carnage. So when you get there, the typhoon happened on the 8th of November, that was a Friday. I got a call on Monday saying, are you free? And then on Tuesday we were in the Philippines. So things happen very quickly in natural disaster response. And then when you get there, so we got to the island of Cebu, which is just the next island over from Leyte. There were about 10 or 20 people, but then over the next few days, as MSF does, it scales up its operations, and there were about 150 international expats from, for all the 5 sections in a matter of days. And then we went to Tacloban City and got to the airport, and we needed a way to. So this was my first kind of emergency response. And it was really interesting to see how it all pans out, because when you get there, nothing is set up, and you're kind of it to start up projects. So we jumped on the back of this truck and got a lift into the city, and we did have a couple of people there beforehand who had kind of scoped out this evacuated hotel, which had a couple of spare rooms, and we kind of had a discussion about what we do and where we start. So there's no kind of manual for how this is done. No one tells you that this is what you should do. You kind of sit down with a group of people who become friends over time, and you kind of come up with a plan. And so our plan was to open up an inflatable hospital, because we knew that there would be a lot of wounded, there would be a lot of birds, there are probably going to be a lot of people who were going to need chronic care medications where they were washed away, or things like that. So that's what we did. So this is Bethany Hospital in Tacloban City, which was one of the biggest referral hospitals in Leyte, and was completely destroyed. And that's outside the hospital. So people worked around the clock. This is a photo at night, setting up inflatable hospitals, laying down the kind of paving, I guess. And this is, so all the local guys coming in to help, anyone and everyone. And blowing up these inflatable hospitals, which is a pretty amazing thing to see happen. And there's the 3 wards that were set up outside Bethany. And that's the first baby born in the little surgical bubble in one of the tents. So I don't have many other photos, unfortunately. I didn't get a chance to take too many in the Philippines. But yeah, that was a very interesting experience. So just very quickly about what you can do as a medical student. You've probably received lots of good advice already, but I guess, you have to get through med school first. It's probably the first thing. So good luck with that. And then I guess, as a med student, just get involved in as much as you can in hospital and ward staff. I don't need to tell you that, but if you get a chance to do procedures, put your hand up for that, and get to learn about tropical diseases and infectious diseases if you can, because that certainly helps on the field. And then socially and personally, gaining leadership experience is a really good idea. That's something that they look for in all kinds of fields. Get involved in global health activities, as you are now, and be aware of what's going on around you. There is, I guess, one of the things that drives humanitarian work is a sense of justice and a sense that all human beings should have equal right to healthcare. As doctors, I guess that's why we do these kinds of missions. So question what's fair and how much you can play in that, and then get involved and speak out. Thoughts lead to words, and words lead to action. So get amongst it and get involved. So if you want to find out more about MSF, there are a few sites. And are there any questions? Yeah, sure.
Any questions? We just have time for a few. All right, so there's a few at the back.
Yeah, sure. Which one? Oh, this one. Yeah. Oh.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Have you ever been scared, yourself when you've ever been in one of the missions, and does the fear sort of excite you and make it a more exciting experience, or is it ever absolutely terrifying?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, that's something that comes up a lot. So I guess MSF are known for going into areas that are unsafe and kind of going where no one else goes. But in doing that, they take security very seriously. So I guess probably the most insecure context would have been South Sudan, because it was that area, because it didn't have clear borders. It was kind of still a conflict zone. So we had a curfew, so we couldn't leave our compound between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. And when we could only go 1.5 kilometers on either side. So MSF, the security rules in MSF happen at a headquarters level, and they talk to. So one of the reasons why we had this big MSF symbol written on our roof was so that helicopters or planes flying overhead knew not to bomb us. So we'll make armed groups or military aware that we're there and of our presence, so they know not to do anything. And because MSF is so, I guess it's quite well recognized and quite well received, we generally don't have many problems. But in saying that, you can never predict. But I personally haven't been. I mean, I think you do this kind of stuff knowing that there's a risk, and you do it regardless. So.
Any other questions? Oh, yeah. David.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Just wondering, does it, like, the madness of the conflict and just the senseless, violence that's going, does it make it really difficult to just get on and do your job when you're just seeing these people tear each other apart?
Yeah. Do you know what's the harder thing with that is coming back here and working here and knowing that's happening and you can't do anything about it, to be honest. I think when you're there, you're just really focused on doing the job at hand and knowing that what you're going to do is going to directly impact. You can only do what you can do, and providing healthcare for that group of people is doing something, something positive. And we can't, we can't stop the conflict or we can't stop wars, but we can help treat people when they're sick. And it gets you. It certainly affects you when you're there for more than 3, 4, 5, 6 months. But I think it also kind of drives you to do the job that you have to do. Does that answer your question? I don't know if it does.
Yeah, it's a tough question.
It is.
All right, any last questions? Okay, just one last one.
Do you have a regular job that you do in Australia when you're not overseas with MSF?
No, I haven't. So I pretty much went on back-to-back missions for the last 2 years, and I've now come back and I'm doing a master's at New South Wales Health. So I haven't since I've come back, and probably at the end of this I'll go back to the field. So personally, I don't. That's what I want to do probably for the rest of my life. So it's probably going to be. I'm probably going to be a career humanitarian medical person. And I guess that's just a choice that people make.
All right, so thank you guys for those questions, and thank you, Dr. Yapa, for answering all of them. So that concludes our night for this evening. Now, from hearing about OSMAT to hearing about the ADF to hearing about MSF, I'm sure we've all come away learning a little bit more about what healthcare when disaster strikes actually involves. So, on behalf of GlobalHOME, we'd like to thank all of our speakers, so Dr. Kavita Varshney, Colonel Brennan, who had to leave, and of course Dr. Yapa for their time. And we'd just like to present a little gift as a token of our appreciation. And one last round of applause for all our speakers. Thank you.